McLaren's F1 drivers keep crashing into each other, and that's not the team's only problem as Max Verstappen becomes a bigger and bigger title threat. McLaren had an extremely difficult United States Grand Prix, where Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris crashed out together in the sprint, then were comfortably beaten by Verstappen in Sunday's Grand Prix. Verstappen's now up to 3 wins from the past 4 Grand Prix, and his Austin sprint win combined with another underwhelming weekend for McLaren means Verstappen is now just 40 points behind Piastri in the standings with 5 races and 2 sprints left to run. That's as close to leading the championship as Verstappen's been since June's Canadian Grand Prix, incidentally another race where the McLarens collided. Verstappen still has a lot of ground to make up, but he's taken 64 points out of Piastri over the past 4 weekends, so momentum in this title battle is very much with the outsider. Even Verstappen himself has changed his tune after winning in Austin, acknowledging for the first time he now has a real chance of hunting down the McLarens, rather than outright dismissing all talk of the championship as was the case in previous races. With Piastri and Norris now clashing at 2 events in a row, team orders still being a distraction, and Red Bull's competitive revival now being absolutely undeniable, McLaren's battling a big wobble that's threatening to derail its bid to win both championships. Perhaps more significant than the fact both McLarens came together at turn 1 of the Austin sprint, allowing Verstappen to take 8 points out of the gap straight away, was the crucial tyre and setup data that incident denied the team on a weekend where practice is at such a premium. McLaren team boss Andrea Stella spoke after qualifying, where Norris only just beat Charles Leclerc's Ferrari to second place on the grid, while Piastri qualified down in 6th, about the cost of this loss of track time in terms of car optimisation and driver confidence. In the Grand Prix, both McLaren drivers were complaining about the behaviour of their front left tyres inside the first 10 laps, even with a virtual safety car period to help take the strain off them. Norris also found it very difficult to pass Leclerc and found it tough to stay within track limits. The McLaren's key strength from earlier in the season, being able to manage rear tyre degradation to a far greater degree than its rivals, simply wasn't apparent in Austin. Pirelli's attempts to make this race a 2-stopper backfired. Tyre management among all the teams seems to have improved greatly. The McLaren is still a tremendously fast car in race trim, but it certainly doesn't look dominant anymore. A key question now is whether the Red Bull, with its aerodynamics reconfigured around the upgraded front wing that came at the first race after the summer break, is now actually just outright quicker than the McLaren. McLaren reckons it had a 0.2 of a second car deficit to Red Bull and Verstappen in qualifying in Austin, which emphatically proved Verstappen's good run after the summer break could not be simply dismissed as track specific. In the Grand Prix, Stella felt things were more even, but that Norris simply couldn't unleash the McLaren's true pace on account of being bottled up behind Leclerc for most of it. Had Norris held on to second place on the first lap, Stella believes McLaren had the pace to fight Verstappen for victory. But Stella stopped short of saying Norris would definitely have won without that Ferrari roadblock in place, because the form of Verstappen and Red Bull is simply too strong right now. Stella has been talking up Verstappen as a legitimate title threat for a while now. He'd previously said that could be taken in capital letters. Well, now it can be bolded up and underlined. The Red Bull RB21 has always been the fastest car through fast corners. Its aeromap is configured around the lowest ride heights, and that advantage is at its greatest on the low fuel new tyres of qualifying. Even when the cars are raised as required for the myriad bumps of this circuit, that advantage remains. Since the flexi front wing and floor upgrades introduced in stages since the summer break, Red Bull can run its car lower and find a better balance through a fuller range of corner speeds. Verstappen was raving about it on Friday in Austin, saying that the rear felt so much more planted than earlier in the season, such that he was able to add more front grip from that powerful wing and still have the right balance. Over a single lap, Red Bull's superiority now looks concrete. McLaren hopes that its medium-speed prowess will give it an advantage on certain tracks to come, and that its excellent control of thermal degradation of the rear tyres will remain an edge on those race days where the Pirelli tyres are less robust than they were here. But that's only a hope, and clearly less of a certainty than before Red Bull got itself onto this super productive development path. And then there's the Verstappen factor. He stole in for pole for the sprint, won that after seeing off George Russell as the McLaren challenge imploded, then was at his brilliant best in dealing with the very different, much windier conditions of Grand Prix qualifying. His pole margin was massive, even though he only got the one run in Q3. In the Grand Prix, he controlled the race from the front, as Norris spent most of his time trying to find a way back past Leclerc's Ferrari after losing position at turn 1. Red Bull Motorsport advisor Helmut Marko has suggested that Verstappen's attention drifted during Red Bull's lack of competitiveness earlier in the year, but whether that's true or not, there is every indication right now that he is at maximum motivation and commitment. Even once the dust had settled on Saturday's controversy, one half of the McLaren garage continued to have a costly struggle. Piastri lacked confidence all weekend and spent it running roughly 3/10 adrift of Norris at all times. This was an uncharacteristically poor trend for Piastri, who has usually been able to pull himself level with or even ahead of Norris on weekends that have started slowly. It's so unusual that McLaren is even reviewing Piastri's car to make sure everything is as it should be. When we asked Piastri what he was battling in the car here, he said it was just getting into the rhythm, a sentiment echoed by Stella, who concedes Piastri tends to struggle more when circuit grip is low and you need to force the driving a bit more to find lap time. This track has a mix of big braking zones and high-speed corners, so driver confidence is key. But it's also bumpy, which unsettles the car a lot and makes confidence very tough to find if you don't have it. Piastri didn't and bled time through the lap constantly by not being confident on the brakes, struggling to commit over the bumps and having difficulty getting the front of the car to turn into the slower corners. This probably played into something both drivers observed in McLaren's debrief, that the lap time here seemed to be derived by taking the car to the limit of locking all 4 brakes, and a lack of confidence would prohibit this at great cost. It may also be that this demand of the Austin track brought out one of the MCL39's underlying evils, a tricky front axle that does not always give drivers the best feeling. Piastri has tended to deal with this better than Norris in 2025, but has not been immune to it, and said the kind of behaviour that we've had a couple of times through the season came out to play again. Norris uses a slightly different front suspension configuration to Piastri that is aimed at giving better feeling to mitigate that limitation. And while it has not been something Piastri has been bothered about trying, it could be that it helped Norris handle the specific challenge of this circuit slightly better. But it's also the case that Norris was on the front foot from the first session, whereas Piastri wasn't comfortable and didn't have the usual opportunities to catch up. This being a sprint weekend meant only one practice session, and the first corner crash in the sprint deprived Piastri of further learning that, given his struggles, would have been more valuable to him than Norris. It all left Piastri with a mission in damage limitation on Sunday. He managed to jump Singapore winner George Russell on the first lap, but this was otherwise a pretty anonymous run to 5th place for the championship leader on what he called a tricky afternoon. Perhaps more concerning is that this is the first time Piastri has returned to a circuit he struggled at in 2024 versus Norris and didn't really make an improvement. Working out why this weekend was such a struggle will be preoccupying him far more than Verstappen taking another big bite out of his points lead. Piastri's in a proper funk right now. This is 4 races in a row he's been outscored by both Norris and Verstappen, which is tantalising for the title run-in. The driver with the most points is on the worst run of form of the top 3, and the guy at the tail of that group, Verstappen, is on an absolute tear. What happened in the sprint was the peak of the McLaren versus Verstappen dilemma. While Norris and Piastri are busying themselves with each other, Verstappen's on a roll and catching up. He's comfortably the highest scorer this side of the summer break, catching Piastri by 57 points and Norris by 62, helped significantly by Norris's engine shutdown at Zandvoort and Piastri crashing out in Baku. The scrappier the McLaren drivers become, the longer Verstappen's run will continue, and the quicker he'll catch up too as the point swings get bigger. Verstappen might not even need the 2 McLarens to be quite so self-destructive anymore, but he still needs some help, as time is against him. 5 Grand Prix and 2 sprints mean there are 141 points on the table. Winning every single race will be extremely difficult, and even if he does, Verstappen will only guarantee outscoring Piastri by 37 points if Piastri finished second in each of those 5 Grand Prix and 2 remaining sprints. Hence, Verstappen isn't in total control of his own destiny. But that help that Verstappen still needs could well come from the two McLarens taking points off each other. McLaren is refusing to entertain the possibility of forcing Norris to support a Piastri title bid, as it wants the two drivers to be free to race. Stella's message is that McLaren is still very much in control of this title race. It just needs to do a cleaner job than it has recently in terms of executing its weekends correctly. But having the right mindset is not the same as actually delivering the performances and results on track, which is where Verstappen and Red Bull have basically been flawless since the summer break, in a way McLaren resoundingly has not. What's more, if Norris keeps beating Piastri, suddenly the theoretical Verstappen gain grows by 3 points in every Grand Prix and by an extra point in the two sprints. Potentially more if the likes of Ferrari and Mercedes can interlope on some of those remaining tracks. More relentless Verstappen winning and Piastri finishing behind Norris every time from now until the end of the season equals a 54-point gain. In other words, Verstappen would be champion. His chances are getting better with each passing race. Norris never quite hauled himself back into the championship picture a year ago. Verstappen has, and it's now very much game on.